Today's video is a summary of how to write a novel using the Snowflake method by Randy Ingermanson. This is a really interesting book and I recommend picking up a copy if you haven't already, partly just because it takes show don't tell to a whole new level, and the majority of the book is actually describing the non-fiction principles but showing them through a fictional story, which is a really interesting concept and not something that I'm going to be covering in this summary video. So yeah, definitely recommend that for a whole different perspective on this topic. But for the bare bones of what the book's really about, it describes how to write a novel in 10 steps. I think I actually have 11 steps the way I've described it here, but same principles. Step 1 is to identify your target audience. And this is really important because this is basically what's going to guide you through the whole process of coming up with your book idea and writing your book. It's going to be for a specific person. And that might be yourself or someone very similar to you. But basically every decision you make about your book needs to be with your target audience in mind. And your target audience isn't even necessarily a specific gender or age. It's just a specific type of person, someone who's particularly interested in the type of story you want to write. So someone who loves adventure fantasy or sci-fi set on a particular type of planet, or dystopian YA with a hint of romance. It's someone who likes a specific kind of thing, a specific category of book, or maybe a particular trope or genre that your book is going to be about. So focus on them, and that's what the psychographic, not demographic, is referring to. It's not necessarily their age, it's not necessarily the gender, it's just what do they love in a story, what are their favourite things about stories, what links all their favourite stories together, and what is going to be that kind of foundation for your book. So that's what you're deciding on first, who it's for, and then from then on, everything you do is with the purpose to delight this target audience, this target psychographic. So every decision you make about your book should be with this target audience in mind, and is your book sticking to what they love about this type of story, or are you wavering off what they really love and getting lost in something else, or combining too many ideas that aren't going to just appeal to your one target person or one target psychographic. And Randy says that you also only need to market to these people once you've written the book, and if they really love the book, which they will because you've written it specifically for them, then they will do all the rest of the marketing for you. So he uses the example of Harry Potter and saying that wasn't written for everyone. That was written just for 11-year-old boys, kind of with 11-year-old boys with interest in fantasy and magic. But it doesn't mean it's not going to appeal to a lot more people. But you can't write for that many people. You've got to write for a person who likes a specific kind of thing. And then word of mouth will travel fast. And if it's a really good book, it will appeal to a wider audience. But you don't need to worry about that wider audience. So focusing on your target audience is step 1. Step 2 is to pinpoint your genre. And this will probably be pretty clear based on your target audience. They'll probably love a particular type of genre or subset of genre, or maybe a small combination of genres that's unique. But pinpoint that genre, and it should be something that you can specifically find in a bookshop. It should be a category or a shelf, or you can look on Amazon for categories and pinpoint what that specific category is. Know that your book can be placed somewhere, that it's not going to be so unusual and unique that it's not actually a genre that exists, because that probably means that there isn't really a reader that's going to be interested in it. So unless you're really only writing for yourself, you need to write a book that fits within a specific genre, and ideally not too niche a genre. Make sure it's something that there's enough other books in that genre, and you could even check on Amazon and see how many reviews the average book in that genre has and that kind of thing to see how popular the genre is. Think about how your book could be classified in a bookshop or on Amazon, and then it's time to summarize your story. And Randy says to do this in one sentence that is 25 words long or less, ideally. And this sentence should include your book category, so that kind of genre that we just talked about. So maybe it's romantic suspense, or mystery thriller, or cozy mystery, or contemporary romance. So just define that category, which is sort of the genre. Then also specify who your protagonist or protagonists are. Talk about what their antagonist is, who it is, or what the obstacle in the story is going to be, and therefore what their mission is, what they want to achieve, and kind of, set the scene a little bit, but don't provide any backstory. That's not necessary. We don't need to know anything about who the characters are at this point. It's just about the kind of hook that would get someone interested and what the key points of the action of the story are about. So then we talk about what the mission or consequence that you're going to be talking about in this one sentence is. Again, it needs to be something concrete and tangible rather than something abstract. So rather than saying that their mission is to achieve world peace, that's too vague. That's not something that your target audience could picture or see or smell or hear if you told them that. So instead it should be something like to defeat the dragon who is guarding the gold ring. That's something very specific. They can picture the dragon, maybe they can hear it roaring, they could feel the fear of being around that dragon. It's something that a lot more concrete. So make sure in your one sentence summary that your mission is something not abstract. And also he points out that either way, whether your protagonist succeeds or fails, either option, either result from this mission should have consequences. That's what makes it a lot more exciting. So for an example sentence, you could say, I just came up with this one, which I now want to read actually. A fantasy, so that's the category, about a girl, that's the protagonist, who escapes from boarding school to save her best friend, the princess, from a witch who is threatening to curse the kingdom. And that's 27 words, but actually in the book, Randy's goes over the 25 word limit as well. So I think this is close enough. It's a one sentence summary still. And if you look at the points, it's got a category, it's fantasy, it's got the protagonist, it's got the antagonist, the witch, which is the obstacle, and it's got the mission to save her best friend and therefore also save the kingdom. And there's kind of a consequence either way too, because if she doesn't save her friend, not only is she going to lose her friend, she's also going to risk the kingdom. And if she saves her friend, then she's got to escape from boarding school and she's got to fight the witch. So it's kind of, high stakes, but no backstory about who the girl is. Okay, so moving on. Randy then goes on to talk about creative paradigms, and that's basically the premise of this whole book, is that the Snowflake method is a creative paradigm. Everyone has their own preferred creative paradigms, and the Snowflake method isn't going to necessarily be the right one for you. It's kind of just about trying different things really and seeing what works for you. So pantsing, flying on the seat of your pants and just writing a book as you go along without any plan whatsoever, is one creative paradigm that does work for some people. Not in my experience, but it definitely does work for some, just not me. Plotting is another creative paradigm, and there's a whole spectrum of how detailed plotting can go. And then snowflaking is another creative paradigm, which is basically plotting, but it's kind of more of a bare bones plotting strategy. It doesn't go into really extensive detail, just kind of focus on the key things. So the point of snowflaking is to make changes and erase parts of the snowflake as you go to add more detail. So the whole concept is based around drawing a snowflake, and that a pantser could draw a snowflake in one go and it would look amazing, but very few people would actually be able to do that. Few people would be able to draw a snowflake one try straight away and have it look incredible. It's kind of a few rare gifted people that can do that. The majority of people either need to plan it out in pencil first and then draw over it in pen, and that might be plotting. It's not his example in the book actually, but that would work. And then to do the snowflaking version, you draw out a rough shape and then you erase parts of it and add in more detail, and then you erase more parts of it and add in more detail. So it gets more and more complicated as you go, which is basically his whole concept of backtracking. A lot of this is about making changes to your outline as you go, so you don't really need to make any changes, no real structural changes, to your draft once you've written it. So it's about, the whole concept of it is about making changes as early on in the writing process as possible. So early, in fact, that it's before you actually start writing, because it's a lot easier to edit a 1-sentence summary or even a list of scenes than it is to edit a whole 90,000 word novel. So that's kind of the core concept of this creative snowflake paradigm. And also, just to point out this quote in the book, he says, "You're going to get lots of advice on how to write a novel, but that's all it is, advice. If you don't like that advice, if it doesn't work for you, then ignore it. And if it does work for you, then run with it." So yeah, this is just one option to consider using and see how you feel about it and see if it works for you. But just to bear in mind that everyone has a different creative paradigm that works for them. And there will be one that works for you. It's just a matter of testing and trying and seeing what happens. So moving on, step 4 is to define your disasters. And Randy talks about this 3 disaster structure, which is basically the 3-act story structure. But it's the idea that every act ends, or every story is split into 4 parts, and each part ends in a disaster. So the first quarter of the book ends in disaster 1, which is when the character must commit to the story, decide they're going after their goal, and commit to it. The next quarter ends in disaster 2, which is when something happens which forces the protagonist to come up with a new plan to try and go about achieving their goal. The third quarter ends in disaster 3, which is when they have to change their strategy, recommit to their goal, and also kind of learn their lesson in order to achieve the goal. And then they get to the finish point, which could end in another disaster if you've got a real tragedy of a book, or it could end in a success. So once you know what those 3 disasters are, Randy says to write a 1-paragraph summary of a book. So you've got the 1-sentence summary. Step 5 is to turn it into a 1-paragraph summary. So this 1 paragraph is comprised of 5 sentences. The first sentence is about introducing your characters, the main characters, and the setting of your book. The second sentence describes the first quarter, which ends in the first disaster. The third sentence describes the next quarter, ending in the second disaster. The fourth sentence, third quarter, ending in the third disaster. And the fifth sentence is the final quarter of your story, which ends in the ultimate success or failure of the whole story. So Randy says that the point of this 1-paragraph summary is just to decide on what your disasters are going to be and what decisions need to happen in order to get to the next disaster at each point. But you don't need to know the solutions to each of these problems yet, just know what the problems are going to be. Then step 6 is to make a character list. And I should say actually another part of this Snowflake method is that it alternates between something to do with the plot and then something to do with the characters, which is designed to try and create balance between the plot and the characters, so that you put equal attention on both to create a balanced story. So this character list is fairly brief at this point. It just starts with the character's name, their role in the story, so whether they're the hero, the villain, a mentor, and then what their goal is. And this is their external goal, so it should be something specific and concrete, like to save a best friend from a witch or to rescue a gold plate from a dragon or whatever I said before. So that goal should be something, concrete again, not abstract. And he goes into a bit more detail about goals. There are kind of 5 main requirements of a character's goal. Should be simple, should be concrete, which we've covered. It also needs to be important. It needs to be something that actually matters to the character. Otherwise, why would they go about achieving it? So there's got to be some kind of meaning behind it. He uses the example of comparing winning, like I think it was $10 or $100 compared to $1 million. The character's going to be a lot more motivated to try and win $1 million than 10. So it's that same kind of thing of what are the stakes, and how important is it to the character. It's got to be something that's going to be important enough that they're going to go after it for the whole story. But it also should be achievable. If it seems so impossible and implausible, it's not going to be that exciting to read. If you don't believe a character can actually achieve their goal, what are you holding on to find out whether they achieve it or not for? It's got to be something that's possible but difficult. And so that's the final component. It's difficult to achieve, but it should be possible to achieve, because we don't want them to achieve this goal until the very end, if at all, maybe not even in the end. So a goal is driven by or created by the character's ambition. So the goal is the concrete thing that a character wants because of their ambition, and the ambition is the more abstract thing. So the ambition could be to be a successful author, or to be a good friend, or to be a good village member, something less concrete, and that ambition is driven by the character's values. And Randy says to phrase every value by starting it with nothing's more important than, but I don't know if that's necessarily necessary, but if you did, that would be nothing's more important than success, or nothing's more important than honesty. But basically it's just those value words. So the values drive the ambition, which drive the goal, and you need to know all three of those things for each major character, or potentially every character in your story. So going back to this character list then, you pad it out with a bit more information. So as well as the name, role and goal, you also now need to include the character's ambition, their values, and you should include at least 2. And Randy says this is because you need more than one goal, so more than one value, so that their values can be in conflict, because when values are conflicting, this is what creates interest in a story, because it ultimately forces the character to choose which one value is most important to them. So it can be really revealing about a character, and kind of revealing to themselves. Then you also should include the conflict for that character. So what's their problem in the story? And I kind of interpret this as what's their misbelief, what's holding them back from getting their goal. And that's pretty much always something internal at the core. So it's kind of what's their misbelief. So if they are trying to save their friend from a witch, then maybe their misbelief is you can't succeed if you break the rules or something. And if she's got to escape from boarding school in order to save her friend, then she's going to be in conflict about whether to break the rules or not in order to do it, and whether she can succeed. Something like that. Then the lesson is ultimately, it's kind of like the opposite of the misbelief, really. It's what they learn to be the truth instead, what their new belief becomes by the end of the story. And then you also need to include a 1-sentence summary, like you did for your story at the beginning. Each character should have a 1-sentence story summary, because every character goes on their own journey throughout the story. And so your protagonist will have exactly the same 1-sentence summary as the 1-sentence summary for your book, but everyone else will have a slightly different 1-sentence summary. And then you also, like you did for the book as a whole, should write a 1-paragraph summary for each main character. I think this could become quite challenging after the top few characters, but I think this would definitely be worthwhile doing for your really core key characters in your story, at least the top 2 or something. And Randy points out this is particularly important to do this for the villain as well as the protagonist, because the villain is often the most interesting person in the story, because everyone is driven by something, and so it's really interesting to find out what's driving the villain. Generally people aren't just purely evil, there's kind of something more to it. So yeah, it's definitely worth doing this if you've got a very clear villain in your story, or even if you haven't, just to understand the person standing in the way of your character getting what they want. Step 7 is to write a one-page summary of your novel, and this is just to get a bit more of an understanding of your story, get a bit clearer in your own mind. So you turn your one-paragraph summary, which was those 5 sentences, into a one-page summary, and all you need to do that is, for each single sentence, expand each one into a paragraph of their own, and you'll get a page. And he says this page should be about 500 words. So now you've just got more detail about the plot, but all this, the key disasters and everything is still there. So then he goes on to talk about this moral premise, and this, along with the 3 disasters, every story also has to have a moral premise, which is kind of like the message of the story, and generally it's the opposite of the main character's misbelief. So the main character starts a story with a false moral premise about the world. So like that one about how if you break the rules, you can't succeed, something like that. And that's what they believe, at least in this structure that Randy describes. It's what they believe until the midpoint of the story, which is when the second disaster happens. And then he says at that point is when they realise that their misbelief is a misbelief, and they've got to learn something new, which is the true moral premise. And that's what they work towards throughout the second half of the story, so that ultimately every story finishes with internal success, regardless of whether the character achieves their external goal or not, which is very similar to the idea actually that I talked about in last week's summary of Take Off Your Pants by Lizzie Hawker. So it's this idea that, as long as there's an internal success, which there always is in every good story, there doesn't need to be any kind of external success. So in this structure, learning the new truth happens in the middle, although I think sometimes it could potentially happen at the third disaster rather than the second, but that'll probably just change the pace of your story and might change your reader's empathy with your character. So you can kind of potentially play around with that and decide when you want the true moral premise to be revealed. Up to you, I think, a little bit. So then just this point about backtracking, which I kind of covered a bit earlier on, but the book says that backtracking is good. Everyone does it. Everyone needs to backtrack. It's just that with this Snowflake method, you backtrack a lot earlier, and so actually you end up doing a lot less work. The earlier you can backtrack, the better, basically. Step 8 is to do more detailed character synopses, which are about half a page long, and this way you should focus on the backstory of the character and their role in the story. But the backstory is particularly important to understand why they act the way they do, and this is really essential for every character, but obviously it's super important for your protagonist and also for the villain. And it should relate to what their false moral premise is. He doesn't go into this in this much detail, but Story Genius by Lisa Cron really goes into this idea, and I really like it. So I think backstory is super important, but it's got to be relevant and explain why your character now has the misbelief or false moral premise that they have. It's got to show why that happened. There's no point giving backstory that's not relevant to the internal story of your book. Step 9 is to write a long summary of your book, which is now turning the 5 paragraphs into 5 pages. So you're just padding it out each more. Each paragraph now becomes a page. And you should focus on getting a better understanding of your story's theme at this point, what the message is. And you also, it will help you notice if you've got any plot problems. And so then you can backtrack and address them now rather than later. And also it might help you come up with some scene ideas that you can use. So then, flip-flopping back to characters again, step 10 is to come up with character bibles, which is where you're going into the most detail about your characters. This acts as a reference for you throughout the course of writing a book, partly just so you don't make mistakes. So it's simple things like the character's eye colour, which apparently often that's a common editing mistake that writers make by changing a character's eye colour midway through. So just to have that written down to remind yourself what colour it should be is important. And other physical characteristics might be useful too. And then I think even more so important are the things like personality questions. And this also can involve things like their religious beliefs, their political affiliations, their kind of life and moral philosophy, their sense of humour, all those sorts of things. Their environmental kind of characteristics. So this could be their friends and family, also what their house is like, what their bedroom's like, how tidy or messy they are, all those kinds of things. And then the most important probably is their psychology. And this goes back to what is their false moral premise? Why do they believe it? Expand more into their backstory here. Where did it originate from? How did it get solidified to be this false premise, this misbelief? So it's kind of for you to create empathy with your character to understand them better, and probably some of this backstory will come up in your actual book so that your readers can understand your character better and therefore root for them more. Step 11, nearly there, is to turn or to create a scenes list. And Randy says to do this using a spreadsheet, which sounds like, some complicated accounting exercise, but actually it's something I already do. I found making a spreadsheet really helpful when I wrote my first 2 books. It looked a bit boring, but it really helped me separate the ideas. So each scene gets its own cell in the spreadsheet. Each scene is a row. And then next to that description of what happens in the scene, you can also include the point of view that it's written from if you have multiple point of views throughout your book. I really like to have a column. So next to what happens in the scene, also I write the time period. Specifically, I write the date to make sure that the time sequence makes sense, and I'm not skipping weeks by accident without acknowledging that and that kind of thing. And for just consistency, like if a character has a job, that you're not somehow making them have a 6-day work week or something, or missing weekends, that kind of thing. So include who's in the scene, where the scene's set, and then also if you have any ideas for dialogue at this point, just include them while you're at it. I actually often get on a roll with this and have whole chunks of dialogue that I can just copy and paste as I'm writing straight from my scenes list. And then he also goes into a little bit of detail because he's got a whole separate book on how to write scenes. But in this book, he just talks about the fact that there's 2 scene types. There's proactive scenes and reactive scenes. Most of your book, you're probably going to have more proactive than reactive scenes. Proactive are kind of what drives the story forward, but you need to have some reactive scenes too. So a proactive scene is made up of 3 parts: a goal, conflict, which makes up most of the scene, and then setback. So the character always enters every single scene with a goal, no matter what that goal, how small that goal is. But then nothing comes easily for any main character in the story, so they're going to face obstacles to that goal, and that's the conflict of the scene. And then something throws them off, makes them change tactics, and that's the setback. So now they leave the scene with a new goal. Or if they go straight into a reactive scene, then they have this reaction to the conflict and the setback. So where they're responding to it, it's kind of an emotional response. And then the majority of the reactive scene is about a dilemma where they're trying to work out what they should do next. And so that means that the reactive scene ends in a decision where they decide what they're going to do next, and then they go off, they've got their new goal, and then they enter a new proactive scene again. But yeah, you don't necessarily need a whole scene for the reactive scene. Sometimes they can be just quite quick moments where the setback happens, the character freaks out a tiny bit, but then comes up with a new plan, has a new goal, and goes kind of straight into a new proactive scene. And how long a scene is, Randy says, just depends on how fast or slow paced you want your book to be, or a particular section of the book to be. So potentially towards the end, you'll probably want the pace of your book to speed up as you're approaching the kind of climax of the book. So your scenes will probably get shorter at that point. But then maybe at the end, as things are resolving after the major final conflict, you might have a slightly longer scene again. So it's just about how you want to pace your book. Oh, and I should say here, I've also got in this green bit that the dilemma happens when a character's values are in conflict, which is why Randy says doing think of more than or at least two values per character, because this dilemma is when they have to choose between their values. And if their values are conflicting, then it creates this whole problem. It's like, which one do they choose? And that choice is their decision, and it exposes what their most important value is. So then step 12, woohoo, is to write the book. And there's this quote in the book that says, "For a snowflaker, this is the joy of fiction, writing the first draft of a novel that you already know is going to be a great story, because you know that it has 3 main disasters, you know it's got a great moral premise, and you know that every scene is going to be interesting because every scene you already have planned to include conflict." So basically, that's it. That is how to write a book using the Snowflake method. I hope you found this video helpful. Definitely pick up a copy of the book if you're interested in hearing the whole fictional retelling of these key points. But yeah, I hope this is a good summary for you, and good luck plotting your novel and writing your novel. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.